Okay, shall we get started? I think there's still one person signing the sheet outside. I think it's time to start so we don't take too much of the precious time from our two speakers of today. And I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker, which is Abhinav. Abhinav Singh is a PhD student, or actually was a PhD student because he successfully defended his thesis 2 weeks ago in my group. And well, yeah, Pierre, let's do it. And not only successfully, but with summa cum laude. And I'm happy to introduce his talk here, his long talk in the Friday seminar. Abhinav is from, I guess, what for Indian standards would be a small town. Bhusaval, if Wikipedia is not wrong, it's about 200,000 inhabitants, which is, you know, a third of Dresden. So you must feel like being in a big metropolis now. And from there, he moved to Mumbai for his studies, where he entered a very, very competitive and highly prestigious program, namely at the University of a joint center between the University of Mumbai and the Department of Atomic Energy in basic sciences, and they have a cutthroat math curriculum there. So Abhinav enrolled in the math curriculum at the UMDAE Center of Excellence for Mathematics and Basic Sciences, which is a 5-year program. And that he managed to complete also with very high grades. And in his master's thesis, he worked at IIT Bombay in a group that does molecular computing. And I found it very intriguing to read the title of his master's thesis, which really was about using molecules, in particular DNA, to build chemical computers that execute statistical algorithms, right? He did something on Kalman filters and maximum likelihood estimators that he built from molecules. And in the course of doing that, he also wrote a GPU-accelerated simulator for exact chemical kinetics. I guess that's how he slowly started to get into biology and into molecules and into chemical reactions and things like that. And I don't know why. You can ask him over the beer hour. He applied into the IMPRS, and he, of course, was selected in the selection week. And I remember still during the selection week, also one of my colleagues from ETH Zurich was here, Mustafa Kamash. And Mustafa then told me over coffee, you know, this candidate that applied for your group, I also make him an offer for ETH. And I was like, okay, shit. Right? And then I learned from Abhinav also in the selection committee that he also has an offer in Oxford. And so I had to work really hard on him during the selection week that he turned down ETH at Oxford and came into our PhD program. And I hope he did not regret it. I certainly didn't. And so that worked out very well. And then in the group, of course, Abhinav was one of the pillars also of social life, as you can see here, right? So he's sporty. So he likes skiing, he likes rowing, he likes going on boat trips here on the river. And I think he's the coolest guy on the boat, right? With these shades. He is also very, very good at playing the guitar. So Abhinav is a beautiful guitar player. He is also, as I said, a pillar of group life, extremely social, and all the outings that happen in the group, of course, are with Abhinav. So here is the group at the Elbe, and here is the group during one of the parties. And here is Abhinav at the medieval Christmas market, where he actually dressed up quite properly. And not only fun, but also Abhinav, of course, likes to work. He likes to work in boy groups outside. He also likes to work all alone by himself in the office late night. And he likes to talk about his work. And this is fairly recently at the International Conference on Particle Methods, Particles 2023 in Milano, where Abhinav already gave a talk about the work. So what do other people say about Abhinav? He's very much into video gaming, like very much. It seems that this gives him more peace than other people reach by meditating. He's so good at brownie baking that people tend to ask him whether he uses a premix, which he doesn't. At some point, asking this question turned into a running gag. Or he's into protein-rich food, like boiled eggs and soybeans and tofu. And I think he likes to increase his muscle mass. But Abhinav does not only like video gaming, he also likes Pietro and he likes OpenFPM. Okay, OpenFPM is a software framework, for those who don't know, that we developed in the group, and Pietro is or was the lead developer of OpenFPM, who now also left, but he was in the group for quite some time. And Abhinav is so passionate about OpenFPM, almost as passionate as I am, right? That he goes out on the street with little stands and trying to convince people that they should use OpenFPM and missionize it. He also sometimes tries to outsmart Pietro in coding. Now, this is for the geeks of you, right? So if Pietro writes code like the one up there, Abhinav goes like, oh, dude, I can do that in one line. I'm so much cooler than you. And then Pietro looks at the code and goes like, and you can see in Pietro's face what he thinks about it. So Abhinav has one more thing that he loves besides video gaming and Pietro. Banana. And so here is an experiment that I would really like to do if it's ever allowed to do experimentation on humans. And no good introduction would be complete without a little bit of blasphemy. A new god, another new god. How will Abhinav decide? But I think with all the achievements that he has scientifically, he at least does not have to decide, at least not immediately, between his primary career and his alternative career. His primary career is going quite well so far. And with this, Abhinav, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for the very nice introduction. Today, I'll be talking about my project or my thesis project, which is about dynamical instabilities in three-dimensional cytoskeletal materials. I would start by introducing active matter, which we observe across scales, starting from very thin filaments of cells or the cytoskeleton, where we observe dynamical instabilities, which are emergent behaviors of the cytoskeleton or the microtubules. So what you're looking at this movie is a bunch of microtubules which are put in together with cross-linked motors and streptavidin clusters and also FD viruses that give this network some elasticity, and they spontaneously start to flow because these molecular motors are working to pull these or push these polymer-like filaments, which are microtubules. We also observe dynamic instabilities of actin. So here what you're looking at is a xenopusec extract, the cytoskeletal extract of actin and myosin motors, and it dynamically starts to flow. We observe active matter at the scale of embryogenesis, C. elegans embryogenesis, where things starts to flow and the embryo starts to take shape. If we look at single cellular organisms such as bacteria displays emergent dynamics, forming colonies, and as well as fishes and birds, and even human kind of exhibit collective phenomena. And what's common among all of this active matter is there is coordinated motion of directed agents by using a chemical fuel. So today, in today's talk, I'll be mainly focusing on the cytoskeleton. So if you look at the cytoskeleton here, where I'm showing you again the microtubules, if we really zoom in to the microscopic scale, we see microtubule fibers are cross-linked. And when kinesin motor starts to walk on them, they create a pushing stress on the fibers. And then that drives hydrodynamic flows. And it really would help if we could somehow use these microscopic principles to then develop theories that could explain the emergent dynamics of microtubule networks to be able to control them or design smart materials with them. In case of actin, these fibers and the myosin motors walk inwards. So you create a pulling kind of force, and then that drives reverse hydrodynamic flows. As I already said, at the microscopic scale, polymers are continuously polymerizing, depolymerizing, and motors are walking to create this emergent scale phenomena. So there's a lot of physics that has been developed in the past decade to explain the emergent dynamics. And what we get is a theoretical framework, a continuum description, which is very useful to describe the dynamics of such materials. And this continuum description is describing a polar vector or a polarity field, which is abstracting out the orientation of these polymers. So you can think of P vector as the orientation of the polymer. And then there is an underlying activity field, which is an analog of the ATP consumption for the motors to create active stresses. And this activity field controls how strong your active stresses are. And you have a flow field according to the force balance in the material as the motor starts pulling, or if the motors are not pulling, the material is passive, and the network has some elasticity to it, so it will relax based on this elasticity. And all this, when the theory is put together, we get complicated partial differential equations that model such active fluids and can explain the emergent dynamics. As I already said, we have two vectors, which is the polarity and the velocity. And these partial differential equations are really just describing how these vectors will change in space and time to study the behavior of such materials. And in the past decade, most of these equations needs to be solved numerically because mathematically they are very challenging to solve, or no solutions. Solutions cannot be obtained mathematically, but numerical studies are performed. And in the past decade, we only had two-dimensional numerical simulations in square boxes like this one to study the properties of such materials. But what about a simulation in 3D realistic geometries of active matter? Can it explain phenomena at the larger scale, such as tissue morphogenesis? However, this is a challenging task because these partial differential equations can be lengthy, non-linearly coupled. For example, in 2 dimensions, polarity has 2 components, polarity in X and Y. So you have 2 equations for polarity, 2 equations for velocity, and the incompressibility relation. So you have around 5 equations. But in 3 dimensions, if you ascend to higher dimensions, you get 7 equations as more components, and they are very nonlinear and challenging to solve. Going to 3D adds another complexity of being computationally more expensive. So if you have ever performed microscopy in 3D, or if you have looked at 3-dimensional microscopy data, you would know that the data, the complexity of the data, or the amount of data that you have to store increases exponentially with the polynomial, with the cubic. But so this also happens for the numerical simulations of these equations, and it becomes computationally expensive. Just to show you how complicated these equations can get, I will show you one of these 7 equations, which is just to illustrate like how long these equations can be. So here is the Stokes flow equation, which kind of tells you how the flow component of the x of the velocity should be. And this is the nonlinear coupling between the polarity and the flow because of the microscopic dynamics. And this equation, you can see, is quite challenging to solve. And to address this effectively, so the 3 challenges that I have explained. So the first challenge is the number of computations. So you have to solve these equations in 3D, then the number of computations are much, much larger. And this challenge has already been solved using the library that we developed in our group, which is the OpenFPM library. And what OpenFPM is OpenFPM is a scalable framework for writing computer codes for simulations of partial differential equations. And the beauty of OpenFPM is that you can write your code as if you're writing your normal regular computer code. And what OpenFPM does is it can take the same code and run it on parallel computers where you would need supercomputing power for 3-dimensional simulations. To look at the challenge of model equations, I'm going to illustrate this with a simple example, because even though you have a nice supercomputing framework, you would need some way of encoding these very long equations or to change the model equations for the study of such materials. So here I'm showing you a very simple equations. Let's say you want to compute x plus y plus 5 on a computer. What you would do is you go and you write a simple line of code. Float result is equal to x plus y plus 5. So when the computer code compiler looks at this line of code, what it does in the background is it creates a computational graph and then traverses this graph to perform the computations. What we have realized is that what we can do is we can take similar approach, but apply it to the kind of equations that we are interested in solving, which is the language of partial differential equations. And this allows us to write code in a very near mathematical form for the equation. So then all the rest of the work is done by the computer. to create the correct computational graph for your equation, and then traverse this graph to perform the right amount of computations. Now, to solve such equations, we still need numerical methods, and numerical methods have been classically been introduced in the frames of meshes. So people would create a mesh on a computer to be able to study the time evolution of these polarity vectors and velocity vectors, as I was talking about. But they are not so well suited for discretizing, say, complex geometries or creating a curved boundary using a mesh. So for this reason, what we have done is to be able to study such equations in complex shapes. We have used a particle-based framework where we discretize instead on a regular mesh on irregular point clouds. And then these vectors, polarity vectors, the orientation of the fibers and the flow velocities can be studied on these point clouds. And then the entire system can be studied for its time evolution. We have also extended these frameworks to solve equations on curved surfaces. So let's say if you have microscopy data directly coming from curved surfaces, such as the endoplasmic reticulum, you can then simulate equations such as the heat equation or other partial differential equations on curved surfaces. Yeah, so all of this, today I'm not going to be going in much detail about this, but what I'm going to be talking about is what we have done using this. So what we have is a new simulation framework for simulating three-dimensional active fluids. And the way this simulation framework works is we encode the geometry of the domain that you want to study in, and we initialize the initial fiber orientations or polarity vectors. Then this gives you a particle-based distribution on the geometry with the initialized polarity. Then what you need to do is you have to solve the force balance equations to get the flow equations. So this is like solving a Navier-Stokes equations, which also are used in climate modeling for the forces to be balanced. And they also describe gas flows or fluid flows. But here they describe these force balance equations describe how the material should flow under the given amount of stresses. When the stresses are known, then the polarity reorganizations can be updated in time, and this process can be repeated for the simulations. And our simulation framework, in comparison to previous simulation frameworks, so previous two-dimensional simulations that predominantly used meshes had a very high complexity of the code with more than 10 files and around 6,000 lines of code. And with our expression-based computing system, we can do this with just one file with 400 lines of code. And we can do this also in 3D with around just 1,000 lines of code. And in the new framework developed inside OpenFPM, all of these boxes are completely decoupled. So you can easily change the geometry or change the initial conditions and boundary conditions, and then solve the force balance equations and update the polarity in time without needing to encode the equations. This really reduces development time of such codes from years to weeks and reduces the number of lines of codes just to very few. And this really makes these 3D, it really makes it possible to write codes for these 3D simulations. Yeah. But why all of this is relevant is because there has been an arms race in designing these materials. And there have been very nice experimental observations recently coming from 3 places in the world, which is Brandeis University, as 3 I know of, but a lot of other people are working on it. So from Brandeis University, the video that I first showed you, where Duclos lab found that when you align these microtubules, you shear align them, and as you increase the ATP concentrations, the motor starts to create extensile stresses, and you see this bending stability. What they also found is that when you, when they change the length scale of the system, so when they change the confinement size, these modes grow faster or slower. And these bends are in plane. So these bends are happening in the plane. And in Göttingen, another set of experiments, I think led by Isabel Guido, they found only an out-of-plane wrinkling. They said, okay, if we have a similar mixture of microtubules and we increase the ATP concentration, then first the material goes out of plane and creates a wave, and then eventually transitions to chaos. Eventually, Brandeis group again wanted to study this phenomena in great detail, and what they found is that they again changed the story a little bit and said, actually, it actually goes out of plane, and as you increase the concentration, the material goes in plane and becomes chaotic. So their story is more like these materials can be controlled if we control the ATP by controlling the out of plane mode versus the in plane mode, which is more chaotic. But what's interesting is that you can see that this out of plane mode at low ATP concentration is quite slow. And the chaotic one happens faster. So it's really the active stresses are really pushing hard to create much faster flows. Similarly, a group in France looked at a depletant to change the elastic stresses of these polymers and look at how it depends on ATP. And they found similar observations that at low ATP, you see out of plane bending. So the blurriness here tells you how the material is in plane or out of plane. And as you increase the ATP concentration, you see in plane bending and more chaotic flow. And then there was a phase diagram saying that as you increase the ATP concentration, you go from a buckling to a bending. And also there is a dependence on how the nematic elasticity, or if this material is all aligned, it's called a nematic, and it has an elasticity to it. How changing that elasticity can change the observed states. And we have then a full story saying, so there is initial nematic order, and eventually you get, with low ATP, you get bucklings, and with high ATP, you get bending, and eventually a route to chaos. And with our simulation framework, independently, while this ANSYS was going on, very recent, so you can see this is 2022, and I was doing my PhD in 2019. And by 2020, we looked at these papers and we are simulating them at the same time. So we started to look at a 3-dimensional channel. So what you're looking here at is a 3-dimensional domain, which is discretized. So these arrows are depicting you polarity vectors, and they are confined in the y direction. So there is a confinement length, finite length, and they're infinite in this axis, in the x and the z axis. And what we wanted to see is that can we simulate such a system, and what comes out of it. So here, what you're looking at is a small perturbation that has been introduced to this system so that we break the symmetry. And if ATP is not there, or if the chemical activity, which was delta mu, if you remember in our system, then this perturbation just relaxes and nothing interesting happens. Here I'm showing you, instead of the arrows, these streamlines, because in 3D visualizations are tricky. So I'll not show you the arrowhead, I'll just show you the continuous streamlines. And the color is the energy, so the elastic energy. So the Frank energy means that since I have introduced a small perturbations, now you can see there is some energy in the system, and you can see it's trying to rotate it back naturally if there is no ATP. So if I can also show you that this is really a 3-dimensional channel. And what we wanted to do is increase the activity levels to see how would this material behave. Yeah. So what we found is that this material then starts to exhibit a bend-like instability as observed in these experiments qualitatively. So there is no quantitative match or, okay, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so qualitatively, at least it shows this bending instability. The video is not playing again. All right, and even though these equations are quite challenging, we were able to linearize them and able to find an expression that allows us to characterize this instability. And this expression only tells us that, okay, either you can change you can increase the activity, or you can actually increase the length of the system. So the experiments of Duclos, where they're changing the length of the system, would affect the out of plane instability. And we could then use this to also verify our numerical simulation. So what you're looking in this plot is that our critical analytical prediction, that where the transition would happen based on a parameter nu, which is like the type of the material, does it flow align or it tumbles in the flow? And this is non-trivial, that how the material would behave with the emergent scale. But our numerics, which are the full nonlinear simulations, below this line show no flow, and above this line starts to show spontaneous flows. Yeah, so this is exactly the out of plane buckling that we believe has been reported by the groups that I've shown. But what's missing is that, again, what happens when you increase ATP to lead to faster flows that I've not shown you yet. So as we start to increase the ATP concentration, what we found is a different set of states. Where first, this was a master's thesis done in collaboration with Philip Shirulka, where the material starts to spontaneously first form the bend instability and then starts to travel spontaneously. And this is a very interesting and rich state. None of the experiments have reported this state yet, but we also don't know if it really exists or if the model is different. Increasing the ATP concentration or the activity further in the simulation we see that the material can start to behave slightly chaotically, but still not yet there. It starts to oscillate between two states. And then eventually, as we increase the activity much further, the bending stability appears, and the material transitions to spatiotemporal chaos. And as it transitions to spatiotemporal chaos, you see defect lines appearing. So topological defects, or in 3 dimensions, topological defects are very different than in 2 dimensions. They are line defects, which are possible in 3D. And what we see is spontaneously forming defects and merging and then recombination of them. And when we saw this, we were very excited. We were like, okay, yeah, this is something looking similar to the experiment. But we were, again, quite kind of late to the party, because the experimentalist already pushed through and kind of published a very nice article about how defects flow and grow in such systems. And they were able to do this using this wide field microscopy, a very cool technique, and then explained how in these materials, at least qualitatively, they form these defect loops. And they have some very nice claims about what these defect loops do, and we are yet to check them in our numerics. But with numerics, what you can do is we can look at a numerical Lyapunov exponent. And what a Lyapunov exponent really captures is that how do trajectories grow apart. So if I start with the same state and I perturb one of the states a little bit, and then I run a simulation to see how they are either growing apart or they are going on the same trajectory. And so looking at this, if the Lyapunov exponent comes out to be negative, that means the trajectories are not going apart. So the system is kind of deterministic and not chaotic. Eventually, but if perturbation states grow apart, then it's chaotic. And with this, we have characterized the entire phase space and with how we increase the activity. So what we found is that even though active motors are working, if they do not overcome the elastic stresses, the material would remain without flow and would remain there. And then there is a critical point, which we have also analytically found an expression for, that after which the material starts to spontaneously flow. And here we have found steady states where elastic stresses exactly balance the active stresses. So it's again a new state that has not been observed in experiment. We have found states of waves and eventually states to chaos. But in the experiments, only chaotic, only the chaos parts have been observed. And when the chaos appears, we see some similar states to the flow states. And there was no experiment where it was proven that there is that this part may exist where motors are trying to pull, but the material will not flow. But when this year I attended the APS March meeting, I again saw a very interesting presentation from the Duclos group. And actually, a friend of mine from the same college that Ivo mentioned was working on these experimental pneumatic droplets where they changed the geometry of the system. And now what you can see is that some of the pneumatic microtubules, again, the same mixture microtubules with Keneson 1 motors are flowing, and some of them are not flowing. And you can see that there is a dependence on the radius. So there is a critical radius, what they have quantified is there is a critical radius above which the material starts to spontaneously flow. So this was suddenly very exciting. This seems like what our theory was trying to tell us. And when we looked at the numerics of it, so now the simulation framework that we developed, it's very easy to then change the geometry. And we changed the geometry and looked at the simulations, and we found that for smaller radius, again, the material is stable with no flow. And above the critical radius, what you see is that the material starts to spontaneously flow. And looking at this, the Duclos lab was not convinced because they wanted to build a different model and to model this specific phenomenon. But for us, it was quite nice because we felt that this model, if it's able to explain all the states, then it's better to stick to it. So we performed way too many numerical simulations, and we tried to find the critical activity because or the critical radius numerically, because analytically with the math, it's very challenging in this geometry to find it out. And what we have found here is that, again, what you see is the same inverse relationship between activity and the critical diameter. So if there is no activity, then the diameter does not matter, the material remains passive. But if there is some activity, then there is a critical diameter above which the material would start to spontaneously flow. And this critical diameter kind of decreases as you have more and more active stresses. Then what we did is identified a length scale in the system, which is the square root of the nematic elasticity K, so the elastic constant, and the activity or the ATP concentration delta. And with this, we kind of killed the Max Planck cluster with I think for a week, nobody was able to even log in. So I'm so sorry for that, but here each data point is like around 50 simulations. And what we found with this neat result is that the critical activity just by changing the geometry, or the critical diameter just by changing the geometry, kind of is much, much larger in a curved domain rather than a channel. So we then made a prediction that if you have a material that's stable in the channel, stable in the droplet, the same material must not be stable in the channel because the critical activity or the critical diameter is super low. And they then constructed the channel. They looked at a material, found the critical diameter, and then put the same material in the same channel, in the same width of the channel of the diameter. And what they found is that the material was indeed unstable in the channel, but stable in the droplet. And just to flex the muscles a little bit of the numerics, I can show you that our simulation framework can also simulate these materials in very complex geometries, such as resembling dividing cells, and where you can think of microtubules which are attached in such a fashion. So this is just a synthetic benchmark. All right, so this was the first kind of story that I have told you. I will tell you maybe a quick short story of another modeling that we did about the xenopus extract in the droplet. So what we have done here is that so Jianguo Zhao, who is working in Grill Lab as well as with Frank Julischer, extracted this actin and put it in a water and oil droplet, and it forms this inclusion-like structure spontaneously. And to model this, Charlie already had a model from PKS with a density-based model, because here the orientation vector is not really clear. You cannot analyze it from the data as well. So you have a density-based model where the density is changing in time, and it's being advecting with some flow velocity v, and there is a nonlinear turnover of actin. So actin is polymerizing and depolymerizing. And then there is a force balance in the material that's telling you with the shear and bulk viscosities that how the material should flow. And there is a pressure that depends on the density, because more density means more actin and more myosin can pull, and you get spontaneous flows. And we could then solve these equations in this complex geometry where you have a hollow-like structure for the inclusion. You could look at the density and look at the flow streamlines again. So these arrows are indicating how the flow is. And that would again fit very well with the experimental data. This theory fit really well for the experimental data. And this was all could be done in a one-dimensional model with symmetry, because there is no breaking of symmetry in the spherical case. So you do not really need a 3D simulation here. But with 3D numerics, you can do new cool stuff, which is in silico laser ablation. So what you're looking at is Jianguo has really put a very powerful laser and ablated this material in the middle. And what you see is that suddenly forces are imbalanced and the inclusion changes its shape. It kind of compresses, if I play the movie again. So it kind of compresses and then kind of relaxes back. And when we performed the same experiment in numerics, what we found is we could also compute the forces on the inclusion. And what you're looking at here is suddenly there is an imbalance of force, which could suggest that, okay, the sphere should collapse, but this is modeled as a rigid sphere. So that's why you just see the recovery of the forces. Then next, Jianguo could also put a magnetic bead inside this inclusion and then move it to see these restoring forces, how they are working. It's very tough to quantify these forces directly from the experiments. But with numerics, we could then compute the forces, restore the inclusion, and run a full numerical simulation of the model to see if it can really explain the rate of the recovery of the inclusion. So in summary, what I have shown you is experiments, numerical experiments with three-dimensional active fluids, and how there is an arms race of designing these materials, which is very exciting to me. I've shown you experiments in complex geometries for these active nematic-like materials for microtubules, and for the case of xenopus egg extract, the actin. And all of this was really powered by these mesh-free numerical methods that I've been researching during my PhD and being able to solve these equations, which was indeed then powered by a very powerful computing system, which is this expression system and OpenFPM. So with this, I'll come to the acknowledgement slides, which is, of course, Ivo for giving me the opportunity to work on this cool project. Some people who were very close in the group, like Alejandra and Philip, we worked together a lot. Pietro, of course, without whom I think I would not even understand how to use OpenFPM, and Quentin, who helped a lot with the physics. My family and friends, especially Akansh and Rahul, who are lucky to be here today. Oh, sorry, I'm lucky that they are here today. Yeah, and that's it. And that's the end of my Friday seminar.
Thank you, Abhinav. I think we have time for one or two quick questions. Yes?
May I have 2 questions?
Yes.
If nobody else wants to have one, let's start with one.
Okay, yeah, you had a simulation of diffusion on the room there.
Yes.
And maybe I just missed it because it went quite fast, but there were some holes in the room, and I expect that they could somehow modify and distort the flow, but I didn't see it. So, something like stones in the river. So do these flows, do these active fluids behave differently, or do you observe something like that?
So if I want to say the story correctly, I think looking back at the movie of the, I can maybe make it bigger as well, because it was quite small. Group, the bad one. Okay. Yeah. So this phenomena is just on the curved surface. So in biology, sometimes like in C. elegans embryogenesis, you can see A par and P par proteins moving on the surface. And when things move on a curved surface, things change and are different. So I don't know if I got your question correctly. Of course, there are holes. In a curved surface, there can be holes. And so imagine walking on Earth. Like if you ride a boat from one place to the other, you are actually going on a curved surface, and distances are different. So if something is diffusing like a chemical, or if it's actively being pushed to someplace else, you have to take the curvature into account. So this is a new method that today I did not talk about so much. I just wanted to say that we also have technology that can do this as well. But coming back to your liver question, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more to really fully understand it.
Or we do that over beer.
Over beer.
Because it's already 22. Is there a second question from someone? Pierre, last one.
The Apple exponent of yours were very close to 0. Could you compute something more than even for the other exponents? And can you see when there are limit cycles or higher order factors?
That's very interesting. One could do that. So I think recently there was a paper from another group in Nebraska where they are trying to compute these limit cycles and exact coherent structures using directly solving them for steady state equations. And solving for coherent structures is not so trivial. I think it can be done, but it will need some more new technology to be able to solve nonlinear equations. But looking at the data, you could, of course, do higher order correlations. Like we also quantified correlation coefficients of the flow to see that. But yeah, data can be analyzed much more. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks again. And now it's time for the second talk.